It's 6:32. I see no reason why we shouldn't start. Rise and start with a pledge allegiance to the flag.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good evening, Bob, John, Roland, Maria, and Peter Bernarski.
And members of the public.
And members of the public. Okay, so maybe we're not as loved as we used to be. We do have a fairly lengthy agenda tonight with a couple items on there that are going to need a little bit of time. At this time, I'm going to call RF4 as our first item. And by the way, I am trying this fully electronic. So if I skip something or miss something, it just shortens the meeting and we're going to move on. But RF4 comes before us. It does not need to be moved and seconded. It's been moved from our last meeting to tonight's by a vote of this body. So I will call Mr. Bedrosian on that item as we speak.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So for this item, as people may know, over the past 12 months or so, the Retirement Board has been vetting a series of private investment funds to fulfill a strategy of reaching approximately 20% of the overall portfolio to be allocated to illiquid investments. This strategy is meant to enhance returns as well as diversify the entire portfolio. From late last year through the present, 17-plus funds were brought to bear by NEPC, the advisor to the Retirement Board, and reviewed by the Retirement Board. And in fact, at the last meeting, the Oak Tree commitment was part of that program. The Apollo investment was also part of that vetting process, and what was originally put forward to us was to look at a potential $4 million commitment. However, in the intervening weeks leading up to this meeting, the chairman of the Retirement Board, Mr. John Chadwick, evaluating the investment focus of Apollo, which is very focused on the European markets and what's going on in the macro environment, particularly as it relates to Europe currently, withdrew that from our consideration. And as a result, tonight we do not have that in front of us to vote and review as a result of the withdrawal by the Retirement Board to us.
I have one question. How many different investments did the Retirement Board work on between January and last month? Yes.
There were 17 investment funds reviewed in its entirety. Each month, there are usually one new investment manager comes to make a full 30 to 45-minute presentation to the Retirement Board. Of that group, only a small subset are felt to fit within the investment parameters and goals and hence get to the next stage. Of those 17, to date, only 2 had actually gotten to that stage, Oak Tree, which we had discussed, and Apollo prior to it being withdrawn. So it's a very detailed and rigorous process, in fact, in terms of the number of funds that are reviewed and vetted.
Thank you. Okay. Any other questions on this item? The Retirement Board obviously had contacted me and they had indicated their interest in pulling back this item, but it was on our agenda formally, so I just wanted to get a report. Mr. Bedrosian, Mr. Goldrick, thank you on your work on this one. Thank you very much. Next item, non-routine. I will call for item, should be FD7, and I will call on the chair of the Budget Committee, Mr. Pellegrino, for a report on this non-routine item.
Okay, first,
Move it first.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move FD7. This is a request to release the conditions on $700,000, which is budgeted in the overtime account for the fiscal year 12-13 budget for the fire department.
Second.
Moved and seconded by Mr. Finger. This report and then discussion.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, if I may, in terms of background, this item, the $700,000, which is budgeted in the salary line for the fire department, has the condition placed on it because at the budget operational reviews, the Budget Committee at that time unanimously desired to start addressing the coverage for the northwest sector of the town. And also, the committee desired to see if a different staffing model would allow for more efficient use of town resources. We came to the conclusion that we should fund the fire department with the $700,000 in overtime so that they could staff Glenville with a four-person response 24/7 beginning July 1st, 2012. This is a one-year experiment, and the chief will report back to us, to the Budget Committee and the full board, on a quarterly basis. In passing the additional appropriations, we conditioned it to see what the chief thought was the best use of funds, because at the time, there was a question as to whether or not we should hire two new and additional full-time firemen, or use floaters and therefore increase the overtime budget, or a third possibility of a combination of two. At our Budget Committee meeting last week, the chief explained to us that in his opinion the best approach was to use the staffing model of the two additional floaters, and that is where we unanimously agreed with him to go down that path, and therefore, again, we unanimously agreed to release this condition.
Discussion? I would add one comment and the fact is, I think when we get to budget guidelines and we have our first quarterly report from the chief to see the impact on this, I think that'll be part of our summer thought process and going into the fall for guidelines. Mr. Tessie, do you have anything on this marvelous initiative?
We're pleased that we're moving forward.
And I see Chief Szynski is with us. Thank you for attending. You're off and running. One of the biggest step towards this issue that's been talked about in the town for about 8 years or so, 9 years, is about to take place, and there's some other things going on that now. But so again, thank you. Okay, FD7. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining?
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to now move ED5. This is also a request to release the conditions on $237,000 by the MISA Building Committee.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino, seconded by Mr. Finger. Committee report?
Okay. The MISA Building Committee requested this release of $237,000, which will be added to $300,000, which was approved in the fiscal year 13 budget without conditions. This amount, the $537,000, is intended to address the renovation of the technical education space, which includes the transportation and construction shop area of the high school. Once construction on MISA begins, access to this space will be closed off, so it is important to reconfigure the tech ed space now. Bids for this project were received from 3 contractors, with the low bid at $537,000, $37,000 over budget. So the district is reviewing the various components of the bid for potential savings. For example, they are thinking that they may want to rebid the electrical component and see if they can realize some additional savings there. If in fact they are able to realize the additional savings, they have asked that those savings be held within the MISA budget for any potential overruns down the road. The committee took this up, and unanimously we agreed to release this condition. With this release and approval, they will be able to proceed, I believe, July 1st with this project, and they expect over 6 weeks to get it completed. And so we would see the first step taken in terms of actual construction, in this case, reconfiguration of space at the high school.
Discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? 12-0. Our non-routine applications are now before us tonight. Our routine applications are in actually 2 different sections because we have our end-of-the-year capital closeout. But what I would think we would do is just go through them, and if there's comments at the end. So I would call on our clerk. All of them, yeah, we'll go through them all.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to move all of the non-routine applications. First, SE9, First Selectman, undisclosed amount.
No, you have to put a number.
Oh, sorry, $45,000. Additional appropriation and settlement, Crosdale versus Town of Greenwich. HD 8, Health Department, $48,000. Approval to use professional services. SS1, Social Services, $45,000. Transfer for outside temp costs. PW10, Public Works, $500,000. Release of conditions, plant site remediation. And then we have a group of capital carry-forward requests. NW3, Nathaniel Witherell, $125,000 for carryover sprinkler project, and $268,317 carry forward for general maintenance. PW11, Public Works, $300,000 carryover grass island grit screw. PW12, Public Works, $60,000 carryover for collection easement machine. PW13, Public Works, $500,000 carryover stormwater master planning. PW14, Public Works, $150,000 carryover stormwater regulation. PW15, Public Works, $300,000 carryover Field Point Road over Horseneck project. PW16, Public Works, $600,000 carryover for the Grass Island restroom.
Those items have been moved. By the second?
Second?
Seconded by Mr. Finger. Discussion? Ms. Tarkington?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I just would like to confirm that in the Nathaniel Witherell, the $125,000 carryover sprinkler project, that $118,000 is being retained or being carried over in fixed charges?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Just a point of information for the people watching. June is the month when we have the authority to continue an item that's not encumbered or contracted in forward for one more year. That's what you're seeing these items are. It also is the month where we decide what we are lapsing. And if I'm correct, Roland, we're lapsing this year, how much is it?
$2,481,000.
Roughly.
Well, it's on,
Yes.
page,
So that's and that money will revert back to the capital non-recurring fund for future appropriations. And then when the budget starts, we have an appropriation going in there, and that's where we're getting ourselves prepared for future capital projects. And that should roll up by middle of July, we should have that number up around 10 million, correct? Any other discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? 12-0-0. Brings us to the assessor's report. Any member have any questions or comments? Mr. Chairman? I'm sorry, Ms. Tarkington?
Yes, I'd just like to point out in this report, under the section tax bill file creation, of course, the tax bill file was created after we approved the mill rate on May 21st. But there's an important final sentence, and that's about the upgrade to Munis version 9.1. The department is commenting here that this conversion upgrade functioned better than anticipated, producing for the first time concise summary reports for the real estate, personal property, and motor vehicle pre-bill certificates of correction. So, here's some software upgrades that went particularly well and better than the department's expected. So I just wanted to point out that
Thank you.
positive point.
While we're on the assessor's report, do you have anything else you would like to bring up?
Oh, yes, we have something very important. We have our new assessor arriving on June 25th, Lauren Elliott, and on June 26th, Finance and the Assessors Department is holding a meet and greet for Town Hall and other town employees, and obviously the BET and the Assessment Board of Appeals and the BOE who would like to meet Lauren, and that will be held from 9 to 11 on the 26th in the Cone Room.
Yes.
Is that correct,
yes,
Peter?
that's correct.
And I believe that in the next day, many people or most people on this list, will receive a flyer about this as a reminder. So it's next Tuesday from 9 to 11 upstairs in the cone room. And Peter, it's being you've been working on this and taken some work, and it'll be a nice welcoming to our new
I've got a
assessor.
lot of assistance from the staff in the assessor's office.
Thank you, Peter.
Well,
And I think the other thing we'd also like to say, since this is the sort of the last month, perhaps, that we're going to have this process, we want to thank Bob Shipman, who's been our interim assessor, obviously an important part of the department and will continue to be to help our new assessor transition into a town employee. But Bob Shipman, as well as the other town employees in the department, have made this a very easy interim period for the BET, and particularly for Bill Finger and me as the liaisons to the department, to Bob and to the others. So we want to make sure that they're all recognized for being most constructive and helpful.
I agree. Mr. Shipman, it has been a pleasure seeing you step up and help us get through this period. I think that this board owes you a round of thanks, not that you're going anywhere. Our sincere thanks. I mean, it's been wonderful. I mean, it's. No, we really appreciate that, and we're looking forward to Tuesday. You're going to have quite a busy week introducing and doing all that. But again, our sincere thanks from our board. I mean, lateral services is an important thing in any environment, and you demonstrated that very well, and we really appreciate it. Okay. I'll accept the motion from Mr. Norton to accept the assessor's report.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Finger. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Abstaining, I don't believe there's any. Okay. Controllers report. Mr. Menarski.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, BET members. This is my first controller's report using the iPad, flying solo. I don't believe I need to get into the training on Thursday. Either you or Bob's going to cover that?
Yeah.
Okay. Page 1 of the controller's report, I worked with Todd Ladonia. I know a number of you are interested in the tax billing process. All the bills have gone out starting late last week over the weekend, and we started to collect prepayments. We actually started to collect prepayments before the bills went out, as referenced in the controller's report, because they can reference on the website and get the total for their bill, and they've prepaid. That was the case last year, and as noted, they collected over $29 million in prepayments last June. We're up to over 541 as of Friday, so we expect to collect a couple $1 million of prepayments in June. So the tax billing process is right on schedule there. So that's going well. At the bottom of page 1 of the controller's report, another good news item. As opposed to last year where the workers' comp account was over budget, this year, conversely, it's under budget by a large amount of money, maybe as potentially as $1 million. What's significant about that is the workers' compensation. It's a self-insured account, and that demonstrates the danger of whether it's health care or workers' compensation, of trying to budget expenditures through a self-insured account. You could be hurt by the risk of catastrophic claims, and it's very hard to budget from year to year, as is demonstrated over the last 2 years, but it's evened out almost over the last 2 years. Basically, that's it. Preliminarily, I'll answer any questions you have in the controller's report.
Mr. Norton?
I don't have a question, Mr. Chairman, but I would like to identify one of the risk management items that's included in the controller's report, and a new, in effect, policy that was adopted by the audit committee last week of the vehicle accident review process. And one of the major benefits of the program going forward in this policy is our accelerated ability to collect subrogation on outstanding and pending claims situations. And that will be a substantial benefit. I believe since the program has been introduced, there's been somewhere in the vicinity of $20-some thousand, which has been received by the town on the subrogation claims.
Anyone else have anything on a controller's report? I have a motion of the controller's report.
Second?
Moved and seconded. Moved by Mr. Harkett, seconded by Mr. Norton. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? 12-0-0. Back to that page. Treasury report.
Move to accept, Mr. Chairman?
I have a motion to accept the treasurer's report for the month of May 12th. Moved by
Second.
Mr. Norton, seconded by Mr. Finger. Discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstaining? That is approved. Item number 7, BET Standing Committee Reports. I believe you have an audit committee report. I don't think there's investment. I don't think there's law. We have one. I will call on Mark Johnson, Chair of the HR Committee, for a report on the HR Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Human Resources Committee met on June 5th to talk. One of our topics to discuss was the managerial and confidential employee salary rate increases for 2012-2013 fiscal year. This important item received a great deal of attention by the committee. There were a number of factors and considerations given to this annual review of the MC salary adjustments. Some of the factors included the following. In March, our compensation consultant, the Hay Group, suggested a compensation rate increase of 2% based on surveys of surrounding metro markets, cost of living rates, and market conditions. From a historical perspective, past MC rate increases were 3.5% in 2008, 0% in 2009, 2.7% in 2010, and 1.75% in 2011. It was also noted that salary increases for elected officials were set last year at 1.75% and 1.5% for this coming year. Another factor was, given the lingering effects of the economic recession, 2008 recession, it was noted that the town of Greenwich needs to continually be fiscally responsible and to scrutinize any salary increases. Recent union negotiations have also been mindful of these economic conditions. Rates of salary increases have averaged 6 to 6.5% over 3 years, or roughly less than 2.2% per year. We do acknowledge that the MC employees have been asked to manage within their departments that have seen reductions in staff and resources over the last several years. They should be recognized for their hard work and dedication. We are also concerned about salary compression as GWI and step increases bring union compensation closer to those managerial salary levels. It is recognized that the MC salary rate increases are only one factor in the actual increase for each employee. The rate establishes a pool of money that is available to all MC employees. An employee's actual rate of increase is determined by his or her current salary, its market comp ratio, and his or her department head or appointing authority head's personal evaluation. In many cases, their final performance rating provides for salary increases of up to 5.5%. This number does get reduced, though, based on the set pool of money to be distributed, but can be higher than the set MC rate. After much discussion with valuable input from other BET members and town staff, a proposal was made for a salary increase of 2.25%. The committee voted 3-0-1 in favor. Members Johnson, Kieran, and Huffman voted for the proposal. Ms. Tarkington abstained on the grounds that a 2.5% increase was already included in the 2012-13 budget and should be fully utilized. The committee was in full agreement that much work needs to take place to improve this whole process, whereby market-driven data is analyzed and MC employees are properly and fairly evaluated. We do look forward this coming year to working with the HR department, the finance department, and the First Selectman's office to improve this whole process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I think that committee hits the item in its core issues. The Hay study and the compensation and benefit package, which Roland has handed, just as a, before I continue, everybody, there's a legal opinion that the town had back in 2004. I have a copy for you, and I also have the effective for the managerial and confidential employees and full-time elected officials. I have that here for you. In this review, and I was fortunate to be at your meeting, and in the conversations, including those with the town administrator, and since then I've spoken with Mary Pepe, I've had a meeting with town attorney on this, I've looked to the first selectman for help, as I sometimes often do. He doesn't charge that much for it. There's, at the same time, and you'll hear about this later, in our meetings with our own controller, we're not getting out of the Hay study what we had originally thought. We thought we would have a bell curve. There is no bell curve. 95% of everybody is rated between 1 and 2. That wasn't what Hay had said to us. The Hay study this year is recommending increases up to 5.5%, as you've heard. That's nowhere near the norm in the area that we live in and with the economic times. I've heard complaints that the system sometimes offers arbitrary. The original intent was to be able to take the MC staff, take the salary and increase it by a certain amount. Our town budget process, going back some years, under, I would say, Mr. Tessie, when he was chair of the BET, we chose not to do that with both the organized bargaining units and the non-represented, by anticipating what we thought things were going to be and put them into the salary accounts during the budget. This way it's approved by the full BET and, again, the RTM. But something is, for lack of a better term, something is just not right yet. We're not getting the product that we wanted here. We're not getting the bell curve. We've instituted a lot of systems and programs, the SMART goals, et cetera. So what I'm going to do on this is, obviously, I think it's important, as I'm going to ask you, Mr. Johnson, and the resources that you have on your committee to do whatever you want to work with Mr. Minarski and the powers that be and we need to do this, because in talking to Mr. Fox, there's several solutions to this and how we could do this. I don't know which one is best. Obviously, I haven't had that much time to review it. But I think if you would, and if Mr. Minarski would volunteer for this, to try to come up with something where we can get the product that we originally intended. And I say that because I'm not saying I'm 100% dissatisfied with it, but certainly as you know, we are always working around charter items, our budget resolutions. Ms. Tarkington brought up a very interesting point. We actually have a resolution that covers this perfectly for the represented, no matter what is put in the budget from a point of view of allocating funds for anticipated, rather than the last thing we want to do is have an interim appropriation. If the BET puts 1% into a salary account anticipating something and it comes back at 2%, we got away from that to stop having interim appropriations and going back. So we've tried to create a better business-like solution. So, Mr. Johnson, I thank you for volunteering, and I feel sorry for your committee members that you're going to dive into this, but budget guidelines are 3 months away. We really would like to have some kind of idea what this is going forward, and that's what I have on this. If any other member has a comment, I'm all ears. Ms. Tarkington?
Yes, I would suggest also that they also turn to the group that was of town employees that were designated as the trainers to basically train the people who are both setting up their goals and SMART goals, as well as those who will review and see, how that, for information and the teamwork of issues that might help them, or the HR committee, as they proceed, as you've directed.
Mr. Pellegrino, anything?
Well, Mr. Chairman, now that you ask me,
I knew it was coming.
no, I'll certainly give you some thoughts. First, I would like to reiterate some of the comments that Mr. Johnson made. As I've come to know the MC employees, I'm very impressed overall and in general with the quality of their work, their leadership, and the commitment that they make to the town. So I think it's important that they know that. I think that they may get positive feedback in any number of points, but I think as a board, as a finance board, I think we certainly owe it to them to let them know how much we appreciate the work that they do. And I really mean that. I appreciate it. The second point that Mr. Johnson raised in terms of the vote of the committee, I did attend the meeting, and I would say that I concur with the majority of that committee entirely in terms of the rationale and the reasoning for thinking about what's an appropriate level of compensation given the times that we live in and where we're at and where we as a town need to go with our budgets. And I think finally, I want to concur with what you've said, and that is that I agree. We have a lot of work ahead of us, and this is going to be a very, very important contribution to budget guidelines and to the upcoming budget, and in terms of how we look at compensation going forward.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Okay, moving on to any other standing committee reports. Policy,
Mr. Chairman, before you leave the standing committee reports, I just want to remind everybody of the special audit committee meeting on Wednesday morning in the Gisborne Room, an agenda for which was posted this morning.
thank you. Liaison, CD block grant. Ms. Kiernan?
Mr. Johnson and I have participated in the last 6 to 8 weeks in the community development block grant process, which the committee came to their decisions last week, and we look forward to attending the next step, which is the first selectmen's hearing on the process, and then reporting out a little later in the summer or September to the full BET.
Good. We have the revaluation team report. Any other liaison reports that I'm missing? Are there any others? Ms. Tarkington, revaluation? team?
On the revaluation report, I would just like to add that our retired assessor has been in town 3 times since he's retired, working with our assistant town attorney, Jean McLaughlin, as these cases from 2005 and 2010 are going through the court system, and, he's in with the Superior Court system. And so he's been here for that, and I would like to add that there were 22 additional cases that were added since the BAA heard decisions this spring. And the final date for filing was near the end of May, and 22 cases were filed.
Thank you. Okay, liaison, we've got that covered. Special projects team report. Nathaniel Wither, Mr. Norton?
Yes, on the Nathaniel Weatherall Building Committee report, I want to alert everybody to a mistake that's in it. In the third paragraph, it indicates that the final submissions of the trade contracts biddings will be submitted. The date is Friday, July 6th, not July 9th, which is not a Friday. And the intent of the committee is that when they meet on the 10th of July at its regularly scheduled monthly meeting, that we will make a recommendation, meaning the committee will make a recommendation for the Budget Committee's approval later that day of the contract submissions, the bid submissions.
So, let me see if I'm understanding this correctly. Nathaniel Witherell, we must have 5 subject to releases, 6 subject to releases on that? So, the date of our meeting, so they're out trying to get some preliminary bids in, and then they have to level them, as Mr. Johnson had told me earlier. So they're going to be coming to us in July to try to meet those conditions, get releases of funding, and begin that.
Which is one of the conditions.
Which is one of the conditions. So with that said, when are they having that meeting?
The next regularly scheduled meeting of the Building Committee is Tuesday, July 10th.
So, may I interject?
I hope you do.
Thank you. What I'm going to do, let me make a suggestion first. I'm going to suggest to the members of the Budget Committee that they make themselves available to attend the Building Committee's meeting that morning, so that we as a committee are fully versed in what they're proposing, as well as their discussion pertaining to the release of the conditions. I think that's important. We'll then be in a position that evening, when it comes before us as a committee, to be that much better prepared to help them in terms of the process. I think that's where I will leave that for right now, because I think the other part of that is whether or not they're going to be in a position earlier, if they can be, to have that discussion and/or to make sure that they have the release of conditions in place as early as possible, so that if there's any questions from the Budget Committee members, we'll have that aired out beforehand. I believe that's an 8 o'clock in the morning meeting.
It's slightly later than that. It's been scheduled for 8:30 the last 2 months.
Peter Minarski, can I ask you, Bob Brady is listening, can you shoot an appointment to everyone? Just make a note, Elaine will do it. She'll shoot everybody the meeting title, date, time, location, everything, and then everybody can just accept it.
Through you to Mr. Norton.
No, to the BET.
To Mr. Norton, through you.
Yes.
Has it been, the meeting has already been scheduled?
For July 10th.
July 6th.
No, July 10th.
10.
Tuesday, July 10th.
That's the Budget Committee.
It's also that morning
We're
is,
having another one on the 10th. Okay.
the Nathaniel Whittle Building Committee meets monthly. Because of the holiday, we rescheduled from the 3rd to the 10th of July. The deadline for bid submissions for the building trades is Friday, the 6th. The report indicates Friday, July 9th. That was the correction I was attempting to make on that.
I got it. Now I know what you.
Right. Actually, Elaine will be back Thursday. She could probably do that for right now, because we didn't get to it yet, because some people don't have their town email address and passwords yet. We'll get to that a little bit later. You're going to have to send it to the BET address and the other email addresses on file so people can accept it as an appointment.
Okay.
Okay, what else did I have? Greenwich High School MISA remediation. Ms. Tarkington, I saw a press release last week.
Yes, and this report is different than the other MISA Building Committee reports, because this one, as the others, have focused on updates, but I've specifically listed the sites where these can be accessed, which I've been doing every month, but each of the reports that have been put out there, there's the overall report, and there are additional 11 exhibits. So there's a lot of additional data that relates to primarily the April testing. But, you know, again, the town has been very open in providing as much information as possible on the soils testing and the remediation plans that have been prepared and submitted to the EPA already. In addition, at the bottom of this page, again, slightly different, this chart below was prepared by Finance and Roland, of course, but relates only to the costs as it relates to remediation, both the costs for the town and the costs for MISA. And it's laid out very similarly to the other report. People might not have looked at it thinking it was the other report, but this is, again, to keep the public well informed of the costs of the remediation and to give them the opportunity to go in and look for themselves. I will point out that all of these exhibits are being posted on the Board of Education website, and that really is for the ease. It's easier to put it there, but if you go to the town homepage, there's a link that brings you there automatically, or if you go to the Public Works Department homepage, there's also a link that will bring you automatically to this particular section on the BOE website. So we've got one location where we're doing all this work. The BOE, as you know, has a public relations person, so this is a good way of handling it. But it can be accessed both for the town, on 2 locations on the town website.
Thank you. Okay, moving on. Old business. Approval of the changes to the budget resolutions made by the RTM. Mr. Raymer.
The Law Committee had an opportunity to meet. Allow me to just refresh the recollection of the body that at the time of our March meeting, at the time of our adoption of the budget, we also adopted a fairly long list of budget resolutions. For the most part, these budget resolutions supplement the provisions of the charter by providing for standing operating methodologies on certain areas. We passed at the time of our March meeting these resolutions. The RTM made changes to the language of 6 of those. If you have resolutions as to which the BET has approved one wording and the RTM has approved a different wording, you don't yet have an authorized resolution. You have an authorized resolution only when it's approved by both the BET and the RTM. At our last meeting, we approved the RTM language on 3 of those paragraphs, paragraphs 11, 40, and 44. But 3 of the paragraphs we were asked to give some further scrutiny, and those are paragraphs 12, 19, and 24. If you take a look at your budget materials, I think it's on page 29, our staff has kindly repeated the provisions there, and I want to direct your attention to it, taking each of these in sequence. First on paragraph 12. Paragraph 12, as we had approved it, contained language which said that the first selectman is authorized to accept proceeds from the use of town facilities, and such proceeds shall become appropriations that the controller shall add to the appropriate accounts. The RTM then added additional language, additional wording, and the additional wording was at the end, which went on to say that the controller shall add to the appropriate accounts for the purpose of reimbursing the approved cost related to the rental of town facilities. My fellow member on the Budget Committee, Mrs. Tarkington, raised valid concern. First, as to the expression approved cost. What does that mean? Approved by who? What kind of approval are we talking about? And then secondly, on the rental of town equipment, the language in the earlier portion had said actually on the use of town equipment. In some cases, the facilities are being used but not rented, and there was a question as to that. There was quite a bit of dialogue at the time of our 2-person meeting. At the end of the day, Leslie was prepared to join me in a vote of 2-0 to authorize the change to adopt the language of the RTM, even though there were these valid dissatisfactions, particularly with those 2 words. The one condition that Mrs. Tarkington requested that I went along with was that Mrs. Tarkington, who probably can speak better for herself, but I'll try for the moment to speak for her, Mrs. Tarkington raised concern about whether or not we had policy in place regarding the use of town facilities, most particularly the use of facilities at the town hall, and that a decision should be made, that it should be referred to the audit committee with a request that the audit committee, sooner rather than later, should begin to try and formulate the suggestion of some policy as to on what occasions should we be letting out the use of the town hall facilities, and on which of those occasions should we be requesting a rental agreement be signed, because the rental agreement is the instrument that has the indemnity language, which the committee thought was important. I'm not sure that I necessarily shared those concerns with my colleague, but for the sake of reaching a consensus of 2-0 on this item to adopt the RTM changes so we'd have the resolution in place, I adopted her concern. It's worthy of a footnote, I think, that a question was raised at the meeting of exactly who had sourced this provision to begin with. And we requested the staff people, most particularly Attorney Ahmad, to make inquiry to see what was the source of the language, because the language comes to us through Attorney Ahmad. After making some inquiry, there now seems to be some doubt that it doesn't have authorship. The First Selectman's Office doesn't seem to feel that it was the source of the language. The Board of Education gave us the same response. This body can do with paragraph 12 as it likes, but for what it's worth, the Law Committee had adopted the RTM changes, and we'll look forward to perhaps correcting the 2 unhappy words as we go forward with new resolutions next year. I need also to address paragraphs 19 and 24. They're analogous to each other. Let me mention to you that, first of all, these provisions, as adopted by the BET to begin with, had contained provision which was asked of us by the RTM. The RTM, as to each of these two bodies, the Conservation Commission and the Commission on Aging, the RTM was experiencing some irritation with approvals repetitively of small gifts. The RTM is obliged to accept each gift, including gifts in small amounts. And the RTM had reached a feeling, a consensus perhaps, that there ought to be some standing resolution that gifts of a small enough amount should be able to be accepted by these two agencies, by these two commissions, without necessarily having to bring it onto the agenda of the RTM. And the language that we as a BET approved in March had said that donations not exceeding $5,000 per donor per fiscal year should not require approval. The language that we used was less than perfectly clear, and the RTM, the Legislative and Rules Committee, had made it clearer in the language that they adopted that the limitation ought to be any single gift. No, that says it wrongly. Any gift from one single donor in a single year, as long as the gifts from that donor in that year do not exceed $5,000, that should not require RTM approval. The point that Mrs. Tarkington raised in some dissension from this language was that there was a concern that a given donor could choreograph multiple gifts, perhaps through multiple family members or acquaintances or friends, to achieve in the aggregate a much larger gift. And the language that Mrs. Tarkington was suggesting was that the aggregate of all gifts to one of those commissions should begin to need RTM approval once the aggregation of all gifts from all donors in a given fiscal year have risen to the level of $5,000. Or to put it differently, a large number of $5 gifts might aggregate to the $5,000, and once reached, the next $5 gift should require RTM approval. I regret that I didn't join with Mrs. Tarkington with that concern. I was frankly more satisfied with the RTM language of a limit of $5,000 per donor per fiscal year. And so unfortunately, dividing in ever how congenial a way, 1-1, we did not reach a consensus as a law committee. I want to repeat for the second time, the posture of this body is we can either adopt the language of the RTM, whereupon you have a resolution, that resolution being a resolution that says that you require RTM approval only when the donations from a single donor in a single year exceed $5,000, or you can have no resolution. There's no mechanism in place for us to go back with changed language for the RTM to start to consider changed language. And that applies to both paragraphs 19 and 24. 24 had one additional problem to it. I'm sorry to talk so long about such a small point. I just don't know how to make it shorter. Paragraph 24 had an additional point that it was lacking the language that talked about as 19 exhibits, that talks about approval being gotten from the Board of Estimate and Taxation when required under Section 30. There again, I can't correct the oversights of the RTM. Our posture on that is either to accept the language the RTM has or not to do so. If you accept the language, you have a resolution. If you don't accept the language, you don't have a resolution. The consequence of not having the resolution is not life or death. What will happen then is that the RTM will be back into the mode of being obliged to approve each and every donation being made, even those donations may be in a small amount. And the judgment that this body wishes to make, I think, is up to each individual one of you. I can't make any recommendation to you.
I have a thought. Roland, Resolution 12, 19, and 24. Do we use those resolutions? Are you using those?
We didn't have any revenues for 19 and 24 for quite a while now.
Okay. Do you see a problem if we don't approve these changes?
No.
And if we don't approve these changes, Mr. Raymer, these resolutions just aren't approved, that's all.
If you don't approve these resolutions, they just disappear. And if In the next year, as Roland says, in the past year, there were no gifts to be considered. The consequence of that will be absolutely zero. Going forward, if we come into a year in which we have a handful of people making gifts, you may have a resurrection of the irritation of the RTM wanting to have some relief from these small gifts, and Leslie and I, or whoever may constitute the law committee, can look at it again next spring, going forward to our March meeting next year.
So I don't know if I'm going to take that as a motion or suggestion, but I'm going to take it. Okay, I think we've put in quite a bit of time, and
Sorry.
I think that's what happens when these items get carried over year to year, and I think it's important that we clean up our resolutions each year and move forward.
Is there a motion?
There is no motion. The law committee did not come out of there with a positive, and I think we understand these resolutions. If they come back, we can do something, and they're not being used as we speak.
Mr. Chairman, maybe I'll make this nice and specific. This is a motion of mine, not a motion of the law committee. I'm going to make a motion just for the sake of make it good and clear on the record that this body not adopt the language passed by the RTM as to either 12, 19, or 24.
Seconded by Ms. Tarkington. I had to get her attention there. Okay, with that, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? This way, we have a formal motion to not move those.
Right.
Okay, moving on. OPEB Trust Board renominations. I would call it this time Mr. Bedrosian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on June 13th, 2012, the BT Investment Advisory Committee interviewed Mr. Philip Skidmore for reappointment and also Mr. Robert Stryker for reappointment, in his case for the position of chairman of the board. Based on the results of the interviews, the committee voted 4 in favor, 0 opposed, to recommending that the BT reappoint Mr. Skidmore to his position on the OPEB Trust Board for a 3-year term ending June 30th, 2015, and Mr. Stryker to the position of chairman for another term of 1 year ending June 30th, 2013.
So you have resolution on those two items.
We have resolution on those 2 items.
Any discussion? Otherwise, I'm going to ask Mr. Bedrosian if he would, let's do one at a time.
Okay. Resolved that the BET reappoint Mr. Philip Skidmore to a term on the OPEB Trust expiring June 30th, 2015.
I would second that.
Moved and seconded by Mr. Raymer. Discussion. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining. Mr. Bedrosian, the next one?
The next one. Further resolved that the BET reappoint Robert Stryker of the OPEB Board as chairman of said board for another term ending June 30th, 2013.
Moved by Mr. Bedrosian on behalf of, seconded by Mr. Norton. Discussion. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstaining. Okay, next item. Investment policy statement. Mr. Bedrosian?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Also on the June 13th meeting of the Investment Advisory Committee with the controller, the town treasurer, members of the OPEB Trust, we reviewed and updated the OPEB Trust investment policy statement called IPS, which had previously been approved by this body back in May 17th, 2010. There's an attachment of the investment policy statement as approved by the committee by a vote of 4-0 and forwarded to the BT for its approval. As background, there are essentially 3 elements to the modifications that were proposed and voted on by the Investment Advisory Committee. The first one was to reflect all investment allocation targets as a percent of the overall portfolio rather than as a percent of the asset class, for example, debt or equity, but rather on the overall portfolio. The second was to provide the board more flexibility in investment decision-making by, for example, reducing international developed market allocations, which previously had a minimum of 5+% down to 0. The impact being that should the should the board have concerns, for example, about investments in Europe or other non-U.S. securities, they can bring that allocation down to zero at their discretion. The third element was to create a portfolio-wide benchmark, which previously had not existed, which is a way for all of us to benchmark the entire portfolio against a target. And that portfolio target is a blend of bond and equity indices. And those are the three main elements of the changes.
So that comes from our Investment Advisory Committee, correct?
Correct.
So typically, we take items like this as a first read. We typically don't put them on our agenda and approve them. Mr. Finger, is that consistent with?
I think my recollection is that we typically do that when we are establishing something that we don't already have in place. For example, when we first approved the investment policy statement, I believe we did that. I would defer to you, Mr. Chairman, but I'm not certain that it's required when we're making an amendment to an existing policy statement. And I would suggest that in this case, the amendment is not significant and substantial enough, in my opinion, to necessarily require that we defer for a second reading at our next meeting.
Okay. So with that, that was my question. So with that discussion, Mr. Pellegrino?
Bill, I hear you on that. I never saw this until this past weekend when it was distributed with the package. So I was not privy to what the investment committee decided. You know, candidly, I'd say in past years, I think whenever a member had an interest in something, it would have been circulated to him or her beforehand. It wasn't in this case. You know, when I look at it, there's a couple of things that I would have suggested. Doesn't mean it would have been accepted by the investment committee. I would have changed the allocation from 10% to 15% in alternatives. I would have suggested a few other ideas and alternatives because the market is not only tough now, but I think the market is still going to be tough. So anything to get income-oriented investments that are not just simply fixed income investments would be attractive, I think, for that board. If they can see their way to doing that with this policy as it is, that I don't object and it's fine. But if we could tweak it a little bit more, that would be fine. But if we don't want to, that works for me. But I would prefer this as a first reading and be able to make a few suggestions to the investment committee. And if they accept it, great. And if they don't accept it, fine, pass it.
So that's fair. Investment committee is Mr. Pedrosian, Mr. Goldrick. Who else is on that committee? Your committee voted 4-0 on that, correct?
Yeah. Mr. Norton is the fourth.
So here's my thought. I think your issue is well-founded, and I don't think there's an issue. So could I ask that I would ask that we move this to next month's agenda because we are meeting. And this way that gives a chance for any of our members to have any suggestions moved to the committee members for review. And Mr. Finger?
I'd like to ask Mr. Minorski what the treasurer has been waiting for a decision tonight in order to determine how she's going to rebalance the portfolio.
It's a timing issue.
Right.
There is a timing issue.
And if we don't do this, then the rebalancing will be inconsistent with what we might approve next month. I just asked Mr. Minorski to speak to that.
She's simply going to do the math based on the changes in that document, so that if it's not changed, she cannot rebalance the money that the general fund has been paying for the OPEB for the last 12 months, which means that I guess the rebalancing would go to July, and then everybody would have to meet again. And somehow the changes would have to be communicated for Mr. Pellegrino plus any others. We'd have to restart the process.
Interesting twist.
question.
But the key is Mr. Finger's point is that we were going to rebalance in the next week or so.
Okay.
Question
Yes.
to you, to whomever can answer it. Do we have the authority to simply give the treasurer the approval to go ahead and rebalance along those lines? Because my issue is not with the rebalancing. My issue is with the maximum and min in one category at least, and having more investment vehicles to choose from than less. So I don't have a problem with her rebalancing based on this document, and I'd be happy to propose a motion if that would make everyone else happy.
Why you have such questions? My thought is on that is that whatever we do, I mean, this has been through a committee structure, and it's been voted 4-0. And I wasn't aware myself of the timeline on this. So what happens if we approve this document, but the committee revisits this in July for a September change, an amendment? Or not? In other words, if we approve this document tonight, it goes and meets the criteria that you're discussing, but one of our members has something that they would like to propose a change, gets reviewed in July, let's say it's approved by us in September, could those changes then become effective?
Sure, yes.
Okay.
They can have resolutions every month.
You could change.
So that's, I think that's a better route to go then.
That works for me.
Okay. Okay, so that puts the document back in front of us.
Not on the table yet. This resolution's not on the table.
Oh,
I
okay,
need to
that's what I was going to
propose
say.
it.
So we have the original document unmodified, so then that would lead us to the resolution you have for that.
Yes. So resolve that the BET adopt the updated investment policy statement for the OPEB trust.
Okay, that's
No, second.
moved and seconded by Mr. Norton. Okay, discussion on that resolution. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? There we go. Okay. Oh, we lost our screen. There it is. Okay, what does that leave us? Minutes. Our minutes for our May 21st meeting. Can I have a motion that are
So moved.
moved by Mr. Raymer, seconded by Mr. Tarkington? Ms. Tarkington, I'm sorry. All those in favor? Opposed? Abstaining? 12-0. At this time, I will call on Mr. Norton as our vice chair. Do you have anything this month?
Nothing other than I'll think about you 2 weeks from tonight as I watch the Palio in Siena.
Mr. Norton gets too much vacation time. Ms. Kiernan, our clerk?
I'll mention two items, Mr. Chairman. The first is that we had an excellent meeting today with Peter Minarski, and I'll let Mike, you can elaborate on that further. And we have been, Mr. Mason and I, involved in the GOSA contract negotiations for the last couple months. They're in full swing. We've been fully involved at these meetings, and we're hoping to wrap this process up by the end of July.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all your volunteering. Not that I give you all the choices. As Ms. Kiernan said, today we did phase one of Mr. Minarski's review. We have a couple steps left to go in that, and then we'll be getting a copy out to you. As I said today, it's magnificent. Thank you for everything, and I'm sure the members will like to see the comments and the SMART goals, and we'll move from there. It has been a busy month. I did attend the Northwest Greenwich Association annual meeting. It was a very good evening. Firefighting coverage was very important. Mr. Tessie, Chief Szynski, Chief Kick were all there. I gave a presentation of our budget process. I must have done well because I think I've been invited back. All in all, I was very proud to represent our board at that meeting, and Norma Bartol offered a very nice comment in her editorial, and I thank her. Mr. Raymer and I have been putting in quite a bit of time into the Northwest firefighting location, meetings with the chiefs, Mr. Tessie. We had a very interesting meeting with the Round Hill Fire Department, learning a little of the history there, and we have some follow-up meetings on a solution to a location for Northwest Greenwich firefighting. There's some options on the table there and looking into some different things. And Jeff, your time commitment on that is, I think, more than you expected, but thank you for volunteering. This month I attended RTM District 8 meeting and the full RTM meeting. This was a very interesting RTM meeting. I've been going to RTM meetings for over 20 years. I recommend that that meeting gets watched on Channel 79 when it airs. I would like to thank everybody who didn't come out and stay with us, well, Ms. Tarkington and I, till midnight at that meeting. But it was definitely a worthwhile attend. We have a busy month coming up. All I could say is Nathaniel Witherill, you heard the discussion on it before. We are not planning on having an August meeting. It will take one major thing for us to do that. There is talk. I am concerned about Nathaniel Witherill getting them through the process in our one set of meeting session in July, and I hope we don't have to have a special meeting. With that, I have nothing else, but I have one more thing that I postponed from before, and I think it's very important. I skipped it before on purpose. Thursday, we're all going to jail. As you know, Thursday there'll be a flyer. We are having our IP training day. Better yet, Elaine is returning back from her, she had a pretty rough go at it with the shoulder, and we're more than happy to see her back. The two gentlemen sitting at the table over there who gave me a hard time about the iPads are now showing me how to do different things. And so I'm going to leave it with Mr. Brady to tell us a little bit what to expect for our Thursday meeting. We're on the third floor of the meeting. It's a workshop. It's no formal items, but it has been noticed.
What time?
What time did you put?
We've got it at 3 o'clock. We've got it from 2 o'clock on, but I want to make sure we've got it set up right. I'm going over tomorrow morning to plug in things and see what's going on.
So 3 o'clock at the third floor of the police court.
Yep.
Training room B, third floor, yes. And I have no idea how to get in over there yet, so maybe more tomorrow after I experiment with it. B, bravo.
So we're going to be issued iPads, have to...
Basically, the two pieces of it, issue the iPad, sign out for them, wrestle over which cover color you get and all that sort of stuff. We've got a couple of things to do. We've got to set up some accounts. So they'd be setting up your email account on the iPad. Please bring your password. If you know what your outgoing mail server address and description is that you use routinely, bring that along. If not, I've got one you can use to make it work. So we'll make that work. Second, be setting up accounts in iTunes using your town email address. So you've got to have the email address functioning before you can do that. And that will allow you to download the various bits and pieces of software currently and over time. You may also already have an iTunes account. That's fine. You can have two, one in your name and one in the town's name. There are a couple of other things that will be set up and Dropbox and the like. Anything you do beforehand, make sure if you can do it on your home computer, want to try, set up your email account, get everything set up the way there were instructions that went out last month, several times, and call me if you've got any questions. But if it's set up and working, that just makes it that much faster for you on Thursday. So that's the first part, getting some basic accounts set up. Then just we'll walk through the basic settings of the machine, and then some of the key programs that certainly I've found useful, Elaine's found useful, and we've been working with for the last couple of months, and how it fits together so it benefits us, works with our business. And then the rest of it, it's like learning to ride a bicycle, get out in the street and ride. As I think Peter and Roland will attest. As Peter and Roland, I think, will attest, is that you pick it up pretty quickly.
I did invite the Board of Ed elected officials because they have the same issue with FOI where they're using personal email accounts, and so I'm switching over. I would say we will pick a deadline where we use the GreenwichCT.org as a certain point in time. We'll have refreshments, we'll have coffee, and it should be fun. Mr. Tessie, if Mr. Kordick is and Mr. Heavey have been, we really had a challenge finding a room. It's getting more difficult. And,
I wanted to speak to that point.
oh, yes, please.
Good evening. To the point that was raised in one of the reports about determining scheduling of the town hall meeting rooms, that is actually a responsibility that falls under administrative services. Administrative services is responsible for all of the space within the building as they report into the office of the first selectman. And we have just set up with Joan Sullivan a protocol in terms of keeping a set number of rooms open for government town use rather than external entities like the Greenwich Board of Realtors conducting classes in the building and so forth. So we're going to see how that works out. We got some pushback, but we told people, we are limited in space here. There's a lot of things that happen. The Board of Ed uses our building, or the school's administration uses it for specific things. So we have a rundown of all of the entities that are in this building, and we're happy to share that with you. It is extensive from during the day to into the evening, a lot of the sports things. So we're suggesting that those groups avail themselves to other facilities in the town, such as the Civic Center in Glenville has space that's available upstairs. I think there's 2 classrooms that can either it could be one or cut into the 2. There's the Eastern Civic Center, there's the library, but we need to be able to conduct the business of government. So
We did run the gamut, Elaine not being here, but Peter ran the library. We had several members in the email popping in. And I don't know, somebody said something about the police department, and Mark Kordick, who was it? Somebody said something about the police department, and Mark Kordick, jumped right in, very helpful. The technical conversations between Mark and Bob, I don't understand what they are, but because we need a projection, we're trying to be able to see this. But very helpful. The chief, please send our thanks, because we see what you go through now.
yeah, thank you. I would also just take the liberty to mention that on Friday, June 29th, the town of Greenwich there'll be a memorial service for former First Selectman Ruth Sims, who passed last week. You may have seen out in the hallway, we established a little memorial. People can sign a condolence book and express their sentiments to her family, her daughter Jennifer, and she has a son, actually who's the recipient of a Nobel Peace Prize. I believe Christopher is economic. They're going to be here at 6 p.m., be in town at 6 p.m. on the 29th at the Bruce Museum, for which Mrs. Sims was also a director. If you've not had an opportunity to read her oral history interview, we did take it out of the library and made copies of it. Perhaps we'll scan it so that you can read it on your new iPads. But I would say to each of you as officials of the town to take the time and read it. This is a wonderful explanation in the words of, as I would describe her, a pioneer on how she functioned in this office, not just to the uniqueness of the politics, not just to the uniqueness of being the first female. That's secondary, but more important, she was the first full-time first selectman. And her comments about the BET are quite telling. I won't be as so, I don't know how to put this, forward as much as I'd like to, I don't want to get beat up on the way out. Read what she had to say about the BET at the time. It is spot on. I came away very much feeling that I'm not entirely crazy, that there is someone else who has a similar point of view as I do, not just with the BET, but with the town governmental structure and process.
You can't cover that up.
I will scan it, though. I'll have Paula scan it and circulate it, because I do think it's very informative, and it's quite compelling. And I found it to be enjoyable read. So anyway, pay close attention. I'll just give you the pages to page 28 and 29, because you might be hearing them at some point in the future.
Thank you very much. No, Neil, did you get those attacks that we just had on TV and everything?
Neil's going to make sure he gets page 28 and 29 before
I could just see it now. With that, great meeting, everyone. Mr. Goldrick, do you have a motion?
Second.
All those in favor?
Thank you.
7:46.